Okay, I think it's on.
Okay. Good day, everybody, and welcome to the TRB AMS 50 Economic Development and Land Uses second webinar in 2024. Usually we try to have these every quarter, but I think the committee's been pretty busy with planning conferences this summer. So yeah, this is only our second one this year. So the topic today is the future of highways. A fairly timely topic, given that some of us are trying to meet the US DOT Reconnecting Communities pilot grant deadline next Monday. So we all been working on something similar to this topic recently. Something about our committee. Our chairs are Professor Noreen McDonald and Michael Lawrence. The webinar is moderated by Professor Guang Tian and myself, Kate Ko. Our committee scope focuses on the impact of transportation on the economy, environment, and society. It's concerned with the efficient, effective, and equitable transportation systems that promote competitive advantage, economic resiliency, and sustainability for our cities, regions, and societies. This committee provides a cross-cutting forum for practitioners and researchers to understand the interrelationship between transportation, economic development, and the economy, land use, and the policies and management approaches required to create sustainable growth at regional, national, and local scales. To join our future events and webinars, please go to mytrb.org. On the lower corner here, you see on the slide, log in and become a friend to our committee, and that is at AMS 50. Okay. For this webinar, if you have questions, feel free to use the chat function or raise your hand, and we'll unmute you and get to your question there. Just a reminder of our last webinar. Had to do with a residential location and housing and transportation affordability and cost there. You can find our recording for that particular webinar on our YouTube channel. Just go on YouTube and search for TRB AMS 50. Okay, so now let's turn to our first presentation of the day. Dr. Stehlin, if you can pull up your presentation, that would be great.
Absolutely, great, thank you.
So first up, we have highway removal in the United States and Spain. Paradigm shift or passive revolution. Something about our presenter here. Dr. John Stehlin is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Sustainability at University of North Carolina, Greensboro. He is the author of Cyclescapes of the Unequal City, Bicycle Infrastructure and Uneven Development, as well as a co-author of Urban Platforms and the Future City. And he serves in the editorial collective of City, Analysis of Urban Change, Theory, and Action. His current research examines the political economy and the ecology of urban highway removal projects in the US and Spain. At UNC Greensboro, he teaches courses in economic geography, environmental political economy, regional economic development, and quantitative methods. Turning to you for a presentation, Professor.
Great, thank you. And thank you for organizing this. I'm really excited to be involved. I'm excited to hear from the other speaker as well. Thanks again for the introduction. Like you said, my name is John Stehlin, and I teach at University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And I'm going to talk today about, as quickly as I can, sort of 4 case studies across these 2 places, and kind of to address this question of, are we seeing a paradigm shift, or I'm borrowing the term passive revolution from Antonio Gramsci, the idea of sort of a certain maybe cosmetic change, but structural conditions that are more continuous. So the history of the interstate highway system in the United States and its impact on urban form and social life is pretty well known. The construction of the interstate highway system displaced over 1 million homes and businesses between 1957 and 1977, mostly in low-income majority Black neighborhoods, and locked in patterns of carbon and space-intensive movement. When I initially sort of started developing this project, I was looking for international comparisons. And while Spain seems like perhaps an odd one, there are some similarities. Although Spain exited World War II as a poor, isolated dictatorship, it sought to grow its tourism and auto manufacturing industry by building out its highway network. Spaniards also, like urban dwellers in the United States, had little say over the highway plan since there was a lack of democracy. And there were protests against the construction of highways through urban centers, as there were in the United States with the so-called freeway revolts. Now, 50 or so years later, or 70 years later, in the US, we're seeing official recognition of the harms caused by this era. We're just discussing the Reconnecting Communities program. You're seeing new funding for what I generally call highway mitigation, can include various kinds of projects under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and Inflation Reduction Act. And so far, it's awarded 177 grants and $3.5 billion across 58 capital grants and 120 planning grants. Not that many of these actually plan removals, which is something I can get to toward the end. In Spain, there's nothing quite like this at the same scale, but there are similar critiques of highways' impacts on cities. But there is relatively recent legislation enabling the transfer of national highways to localities so that they can be reformed to more urban uses. This really began as a way to reduce central government maintenance costs, but increasingly is being used to implement more sustainable transportation and development. And between 2011 and 2021, there were 147 of these transfers, what are called cesiones, often to very small localities. Now, these don't, similar to the United States, don't necessarily guarantee conversion to a street or a boulevard, but it does create the potential for it. To give you a sense of my kind of conceptual approach, I draw on the scholarship on the history and structure of automobility and its impacts on urban life. A major focus of which is the way that racism shaped highway investment, its role in slum clearance, slum in quotes there, and racialized divisions between city and suburb along transportation lines. A second thread of this is the way that urban sustainable development and gentrification have become interwoven in contemporary urbanism, where densification and housing / land use alignment is both necessary for reducing carbon emissions and currently driven largely by private investment and patterns of middle class or elite settlement. And there are growing calls within this context for a return to the public sector as not just kind of providing the framework, but actually producing housing, much needed affordable housing. And a third thread is political. You're seeing there's a growing scholarship on the tensions between municipalities and higher levels of government, particularly states, things like preemption laws that preempt local changes, local, usually progressive legislation. And these are, in my mind, driven by distinct approaches to economic development, with cities generally seeking densification, transit investment, quality of life, while states seeking to maintain vehicle flow and facilitating a more dispersed approach to development. Some of the key models of highway removal mainly come from the United States, Portland, San Francisco, Boston with the Big Dig, more recently Milwaukee, but also notable examples from Seoul, Madrid, Utrecht. But these were mainly driven by local policy entrepreneurs and planning initiatives. As I mentioned, you're seeing these increasingly national policy frameworks like the Reconnecting Communities program and the sort of the transfer of highways in Spain. And so in that context, I'm looking at several case studies in the United States, Rochester, New York, and Dallas, Texas. And in Spain, I'll talk about Madrid and Bilbao in the Basque Country. And in these kind of upcoming slides, there's kind of a lot of information. So let me know if there's something that you can't quite see or that isn't that clear. So first talking about Rochester, this is a view of Rochester in the 1990s. You can see downtown in the center and the Park Avenue neighborhood on the right. This is the eastern portion of the inner loop that encircled downtown. And then we're now shifting to 2024, where you can see that that inner loop has been removed, filled in, reconnecting Park Avenue with downtown. This is what it looks like. You've probably seen lots of these images because this is really a standout case. The inner loop carried between 12,000 and 30,000 vehicles per day, so not very many actually by modern standards. And it was filled in between 2017 and 2019 at the cost of roughly $25 million, including a $17 million Tiger grant. This created 6 acres of land on which roughly 550 housing units have been built, including 60% that are below market rate, along with a new hotel, off-street bikeway, new commercial spaces, and so on. There's been an estimated over 250 million in investment as a result of this removal. Now returning to the overhead view, the next phase is the northern section of the inner loop, for which Governor Kathy Hochul has appropriated $100 million in the 2023 budget. But this is a much more challenging stretch of highway. It carries more cars, but it's also a much more dramatic kind of social divide. The eastern section divided a relatively prosperous district, Park Avenue, from downtown. This section separates a very low-income neighborhood, Market View Heights, a lot of large industrial sites, including some derelict industrial sites, derelict commercial space, from a relatively prosperous section of downtown. And so there are significant concerns about gentrification, as well as desires for affordable home ownership for the Black community in that neighborhood, which was, of course, lost when the highway was built. Just to give you a sense of some of the kind of underlying economic data, this is the assessed value per square foot on the parcels surrounding these areas. So you can see that, and not a ton has changed. Of course, you know, new parcels mean new tax assessment, but not a ton has changed between the removal of the inner loop east and in 2019 and today. And you can see that the divide is not so great in terms of property values. This divide is, of course, much more significant. And so this is going to be the challenge that that planners have to engage with in this context. Okay, breezing through these. The next case that I want to talk about is Dallas, Texas. This is really a case of blocked highway removal. So this is I-345 here. There's a very short section of highway separating downtown Dallas from the Deep Ellum neighborhood. The Deep Ellum was a Black neighborhood and a center for the blues in Texas. Now this is more of a general kind of gentrified nightlife district. Starting 2014, there was a very coordinated organizing campaign to remove the highway, led by an urban planner named Patrick Kennedy and some of his allies at D Magazine. And the rationale that they used was that the removal of the highway could expand the tax base very dramatically, and the buildable land would pay for itself as sort of an extending downtown, but also creating much needed affordable housing. And you're seeing some changes in the coalition over time. The image you see on the top right is from an event that was organized by participants in some kind of newer participants in the coalition, including some involved in the local YIMBY chapter, as well as some environmental justice organizing students. This highway carries as many as 180,000 vehicles daily. So the Texas Department of Transportation really balked at this, at simply removing this highway. Ultimately, though, after seemingly entertaining the idea in 2023, TxDOT and the North Central Texas Council of Governments, who really control the purse strings of federal money, opted for a $1 billion, what they call a hybrid trench design. So this is going to be really built out over the next 10 years. It would create opportunities for capping the highway, but these would have to be funded by the city itself and would really create little to no development potential. So this really kind of frustrated the ambitions of these advocates. Again, to give you an image of the kind of underlying political economy, this is the section of highways. So we can see that the real gap in terms of land values is actually formed by I-30, which is to the south, separating downtown from historically Black South Dallas. This would really be kind of filling in a gap between two relatively well-developed areas. But nevertheless, you know, the plan involved plans for affordable housing development, sustainable transportation, and so on, right? Now, moving on to Spain. Spain is seeing some similar highly divergent patterns of development between urban cores and surrounding areas. And I know the labeling on here is small, but basically between 2006 and 2017, Spain shot to the top of the countries in the EU in terms of highway miles. Building highways faster than anywhere in Europe, also high-speed rail faster than anywhere in Europe. And these highways are really for both passenger and freight travel. And you can see a diagram of the estimated greenhouse gas emissions of this very centralized highway network. At the same time, within cities, there are increasing efforts to reduce auto dependence and encourage more sustainable travel, including creating pedestrianized areas. So you're seeing this real tension between urban cores and their surrounding regions and the plans of subnational governments and nation states around transportation. One of the flagship examples of this sort of humanization, as they would say in Spain, of the urban core areas is the M30 project in Madrid, which was completed in 2007 and buried over 50 kilometers of this orbital highway surrounding the city center. You can see what it looked like on both banks of the river, and you can see what it looks like today. This created the Madrid-Rio Park and reduced a major social and economic barrier between the urban core and the working class southwestern neighborhoods, but also led to kind of dramatic gentrification in the areas immediately surrounding the development. It also, so this is a section of the A5, a radial highway, and it joins the M30 just out of view up to the top right of the screen. It also involved burying a section of this highway, right? And you can see the change from the 1990s to the present. This created an expectation that something would be done to address the rest of the A5, which had been ceded to the city. So it was the city's responsibility by the central government as an urban street as part of this whole redevelopment. And there's also out of view to the bottom left is a large derelict military facility that is also scheduled for redevelopment. So there's an expectation that there was going to be something done about this highway that cuts through this neighborhood. And you can see that it cuts through the neighborhood in a very aggressive way. It was steadily widened over a period of time. Houses are within 2 meters and sometimes at sort of tailpipe level you're walking to enter your house. It carries roughly 80,000 vehicles per day. And in 2018, the left-wing government of Manuela Carmena initiated a boulevard conversion of the A5. The plan was to introduce traffic lights, reduce speeds, add bus-only lanes, bikeways, pedestrian crossings, et cetera, et cetera. In 2019, a conservative government won the won control of the city and immediately halted the project, proposing instead to bury the highway. So the bottom left is the plan that has now been finally kind of worked out and published to bury the highway with 3 lanes of travel underneath the ground and just 1 lane of travel above. So since then, there have been endless delays, obviously the COVID-19 pandemic, but also kind of endless revisions of the budgets, kind of juggling the project back and forth between different agencies. And only in mid-2023 was this project plan actually published, an estimated of about 500 million euros to complete the project. And so you have very angry local residents. This is a sign that says Almeida, who's the new mayor, bury the Avenida de Portugal, continuing the tunnel. Don't fool us again, right? So this again caused a lot of anger, and still nothing has really happened in that case. So maybe it's a stalled, maybe blocked. It's hard to say necessarily. And then finally, looking at Bilbao, Bilbao has undertaken a massive redevelopment of its urban core. Of course, famously, the Guggenheim Bilbao was part of this redevelopment since the closure of its heavy industries in the 1980s. And this includes a number of mobility improvements and highway removals, burials, and relocations, and so on. One recent example is the elevated access road to the A8 highway through the Basurto neighborhood, which was removed in 2013. You also have the burial of a railroad, a freight railroad line. This highway carried as many as 60,000 vehicles per day, but the access point was actually relocated, as you can see this change over time, to a new partial tunnel adjacent to the Olabeaga neighborhood, which is a lower income neighborhood sort of at the edge of the urban core. This accompanied the development of a new stadium and several mixed-use towers. To give you a sense of what this looked like, this is the old A8 access point. This is what it looked like below. People described, suddenly tons more light coming into their houses that they sort of had never even thought of as being possible. It's now a very beautiful public space. Bottom left is what it looks like today. But bottom right is the Olabeaga neighborhood. Now you have this partially covered highway cutting through it. Of course, this partial covering was actually the result of victories of activists involved trying to prevent kind of more noise in this already kind of heavily industrially or infrastructurally burdened neighborhood. And then finally, one last piece from Bilbao is the A8 itself. This stretch is slated to be removed and buried. The plan is to tunnel through this. It looks flat from above, but it's a pretty large mountain. And this project has been slated for well over a decade. This is what conditions look like today. This sort of the place in Spain that I felt looked like the most like the United States, with a large highway overpass sort of dominating a neighborhood. This is a marginalized low-income neighborhood at the edge of downtown. You can see on the bottom left a protest against the highway and the plan for the new highway route. So the talk of removal, like I said, stretched as far back as I think 2010 to the planning of that other access road demolition, but it encountered funding issues and delays. Finally, you're seeing planning underway, and the highway is scheduled to be removed in 2027. So some tentative conclusions. I think these projects exemplify the tensions between cultivating place and maintaining flow. And to simplify a bit, these priorities kind of map onto urban versus regional/national priorities. So you see conflicts between cities over how these projects look. Completed projects like Rochester's demonstrate the enormous potential for more sustainable and just development because the land passes into public control. And this is a rare moment to develop at this kind of scale. However, the cases of sustainable, successful removal like Rochester's are also typically the result of underutilization of the highway, which suggests that they may not alter travel behavior at a regional scale as much as we might hope. And then when the highways are highly utilized, burial is enormously costly, typically does not create new developable land, and allows car travel and emissions to continue. And this even includes with electric cars, you still have brake pad and tire particulate matter emissions. And so in this way, the pressure to maintain highway capacity can undermine the broader social and environmental goals of removals. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Thank you for organizing this talk, and I'm really happy to answer questions and have our discussion after the next presentation. So thank you all.
Great, thank you. It looks like we don't have any questions in the chat quite yet. I'm sure they will come. So why don't we go ahead with the next presentation and save all the questions and answers towards the end of the presentation here. Okay, so next up, Fatemeh, if you can pull up your presentation while I'll introduce you, that would be great. Next up, we have Bridging the Gap with Highway Cap, Reshaping Urban Landscapes Without Gentrification. Our presenter today, Fatemeh Janatabadi, is a PhD student in Geography and Geoinformation Science at George Mason University, with a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and a master's in transportation engineering. She has transitioned from an engineering background to a scientific focus on human mobility, spatial accessibility, and social equity, as well as the intersections of mobility and climate change. Fatemeh has contributed to scientific literature by examining access theory in spatial analysis and access spatial mismatch. She is currently investigating the impacts of extreme climate events on the mobility of vulnerable communities, as well as the equity implications of shelter accessibilities and other critical resources. Her work aims to enhance community resilience in urban and regional settings. Take it away.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you so much for the introduction. This is one of our recent studies that I've been doing with my advisor, Dr. Ermagan, and I'm happy to present it here. We're going to talk about gentrification, but before that, let's talk about highways. In the mid-20th centuries, highways were seen as a symbol of modernity and progress, helping to connect cities and suburbs, promoting economic development. Today, the United States has built and expanded over 200,000 miles of state and interstate highways. Through this extensive network, they have increased access and facilitated cross-country travel. But many of these projects also resulted in destruction of neighborhoods, especially in low-income and minority communities, contributing to urban sprawl and exacerbating car dependency across the United States. But these days, the conversation is shifting as urban planners and policymakers are recognizing some of the negative impacts of highways. Now they face the question of whether to keep and maintain the highways in their current form or tear them down, changing them into boulevards or building highway caps. We specifically want to talk about highway caps. Highway caps, or they're also known as freeway caps or lit parks, are structures that are built over existing highways. And the aim is to create new land use. These caps can be used as parks, commercial spaces, residential area, or any other public entities. They have a lot of benefits, of course. They can reconnect communities because they have the potential to reunite neighborhoods that were once divided by highways. These caps can also provide opportunities to reduce segregation. They improve accessibility by physically reconnecting neighborhoods that were once separated. They also improve walkability of the neighborhoods. They provide better access to public places and improve mobility. They have a lot of environmental benefits. they incorporate green infrastructure, so they can turn previously unused spaces into parks or gardens and even recreational areas. Of course, the creation of green spaces has benefits for both the environments and public health. One other benefits of highway cap projects that are very important, especially these days, with all the conversations about the impact of climate on transport infrastructure, is their use or benefits regarding stormwater management. Cities with highway caps can integrate sustainable drainage system that help manage runoff, reduce the risk of flooding, and improve local water quality. And overall, these projects can support a city's resilience to climate change and extreme weather events. They also have economic benefits as well. They can make neighborhoods more attractive and accessible, so the land value in adjacent neighborhoods increases. This opens up new opportunities for new commercial investments, such as local businesses, cafes, or mixed-use developments. And lastly, they improve the aesthetic and cultural aspects of the cities. These highway caps can offer opportunities for public art, cultural spaces, and pedestrian-friendly environments. These improvements can uplift the pride of community and serve as a focal point for local gathering or other social events. But with all of these benefits, that I talked about, the land value increases and connectivity also improves. So property values, property prices increases, and this increase in the prices results in pushing out people that there were once these projects were developed to serve them. So there's a risk of gentrification. In this research, in this project, we try to see whether highway caps projects can be a driver of gentrification in the United States. We assessed the impact of highway caps on neighborhood operating, and we looked for potential for gentrification. Specifically, we analyzed the impact of demographic, socioeconomic, and housing, the changes in demographic, socioeconomic, and housing characteristics across 10 different highway caps projects in the United States. These projects were selected mainly from 4 states across the United States: Arizona, Washington, Missouri, and Texas. The latest ones were completed in 2015, and the earliest one that we analyzed dates back to 1992. They have different sizes, and they are covering different highways across the country. How we analyzed the impact was through quasi-experimental research design. We tried to investigate the impact of highway caps on demographic, socioeconomic, and housing characteristics. We specifically looked into 8 variables, and our analysis were at the census tract geographical level. We use this quasi-experimental research design because this approach differentiates between the population undergoing the intervention. We call them treatment group. In our case, by treatment group, we mean the census tracts that are located in the neighborhood of highway cap projects. And we also examine the changes in the control tracts or control group. Control groups are the census tracts that are close to highway cap projects, but we assume that they are not directly impacted by those projects. For our analysis, we used 2 data sets. We used US decennial census data and also American Community Survey 5 years estimates. The reason for using 2 different data sources was because some of our projects dated, as I said, back to 1992, and before 2005, the demographic and socioeconomic characteristics were collected through US decennial. After 2005, the details were collected through the American Community Survey. So for the projects that were before 2005, we used decennial census data, and the projects after 2005, we used ACS data source. The next step for us was to select the treatment and control tracks for each of our projects. These projects were, first of all, we found the exact location of each highway cap project, and then we used 2 different buffers. We created 1/2 a mile buffer and 1 5-mile buffer around these projects. So every census tract that falls within that 1/2 a mile buffer is considered as treatment tracts. And all of our potential control tracks were located outside the 1/2 a mile buffer and within the 5-mile buffer. The next step for us was to select a control track for each of our treatment tracks. We did that through propensity score matching technique. What we did was we looked into all of these potential tracks for each of the treatment tracks. We found those tracks that highly resembled the socioeconomic, demographic, and housing characteristics of those treatment tracks. For each treatment, we found 2 control tracks. The example that you're seeing here is one of the projects that we analyzed as Hans Park. This project had 6 treatment tracks and 12 control tracks. The quasi-experimental method that we used is summarized in this figure. We use DID, or difference in difference analysis. It includes 3 major steps. First, we calculated the before and after difference of operating indicators for treatment tracks. This initial steps controls for factors that are constant over time within the group by comparing the same group to itself. The second step was to calculate the before-after difference in control tracks, which were exposed to the same set of environmental conditions at the treatment group. This step captures time-varying factors affecting both groups. And finally, we subtracted the second difference from the first difference to remove all time-varying factors from the analysis. This process leaves us with the impact estimation, or as we call it, difference in difference. If this difference in difference is statistically significant, then we can claim that the impact of highway cap on those specific characteristics in that neighborhood is significant. This table shows our results. You can see it for every project and also for every demographic, socioeconomic, and housing variables. We assessed our results in 2 ways. First, we looked at them project by project, and then we looked at each characteristics, or as we call them, neighborhood operating indicators. So when we look at the results project by project, we see that only in 2 of them there are statistically significant changes. We see that, I highlighted them, we see that in Arbor Davis project and Luther Burbank. These projects have different sizes. Both of them are from 1992. And in these projects, we see that the share of African-American decreased in the neighborhood of highway cap projects. The poverty rate also decreased, and the income level improved, and education level of the population also improved. For Luther Burbank, we only saw a significant change in the share of African-American population. But for other projects, although we found some changes, but those changes were not statistically significant to draw a conclusion based on them. We also look at the changes in each of the variables separately. We wanted to see if these highway caps projects have more impact on some specific variables more than the others. So we looked at how the share of racial categories changed. Almost across all of them, we see a kind of a balance. For example, when we look at the share of white population, we see in some of the projects, and almost half of them, there was an increase in share of this population. In the other half, there was decrease. when we look at the share of African Americans, we see in more than half of them, there was an increase in share of this population. Only in 3 of them, we observed a decrease in the share of African Americans. Looking at education level, we almost see a balance between increase and decrease. Looking at income variable, we see that the majority of census tracts located in the neighborhood highway cap projects have undergone improvements from economic perspective. And but when we looked at households that are experiencing poverty, we also see like a balance between increase and decrease. The rents also in half of the projects increased, and the other half decreased in the highway cap neighborhoods. Looking at the housing units, this specifically means the number of units available in the neighborhoods. We observed mostly an increase in the number of units available, but when we looked at the vacant housing units, we saw that the number of vacant units decreased or remained stable in almost 80% of these projects. We looked only into 10 highway cap projects. The reason for that was simply data availability. We couldn't find data we couldn't find non-overlapping data or available data for other projects, but there are over 50 highway caps projects across the US that have been completed or in progress of design or implementation. Because of data, we only looked at 10 of them, but we couldn't find any evidence, any statistically significant evidence of gentrification to argue that whether these highway caps projects can drive gentrification in these neighborhoods. But when we look at the literature, we find that other projects that looked into the impacts of changing highways into boulevards or developing transit-oriented neighborhoods, or even improving the green spaces in the neighborhood, or even we found evidence of urban trails that can lead to gentrification. Of course, these have a varying extent of impacts, but based on our sample, which is not a big sample, but it is a good number of projects, we couldn't find evidence of gentrification. Of course, there should be efforts to reconnect communities, but in reconnecting communities, we always need to be careful about how we're impacting the social dynamic of those neighborhoods and whether we're causing any social injustice or not. Based on our results, highway caps could be considered as a potential approach to reconnect communities, but we can say that probably the risk of causing gentrification as a result of these projects seem to be low. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Good. Thank you for you two. It's great presentations. If anyone have questions, feel free to raise your hand to ask, or type in the chat. We got about 15 minutes for the discussion, which is it's good. I will start with a couple ones. Well, if people are typing their questions on the chat. First one, I have a question for John. I know in New Orleans we have a I-10 ran through the Claiborne neighborhood, which has been talked for years about removal. My feeling from the local communities, the transportation engineers, planners, I think there are two main concerns. Maybe you have some insights, provide your perspective on that. The first one is about about the cost and whether, remove that, help to restore the neighborhoods used to be there, right? So for who are going to pay for that, usually it's cost a lot. And also when you remove that, people, it's been decades, right? The generations has changed, whether, it's going to be back to what it used to be. And the second question is, I think for more from the engineer side is what the traffic going to do, right? So like particularly here, that is important connection between the downtown, the West Bank, and the through traffic, and like what you see, in other regions have done that, how they deal with that traffic flow overall for the region.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. I mean, I've paid a little bit of attention to the New Orleans example because I think it's a really rich one. I don't have a lot of. I probably don't have a lot of earth-shattering insights or anything like that. But in terms of sort of the remaking of the neighborhood, obviously you can't just sort of. I think that it does. Removing the highway doesn't just create the process in reverse, right? Just sort of reverts to its previous state, right? Because its previous state was, a period where there was much less car use. It was a much more kind of streetcar type suburb or streetcar suburb neighborhood, from my understanding. I do think that there, I don't know what the state law is in Louisiana, but in the case of New York, the fact that the city, it became city land, right, and that they could attach conditions to bids for that land, I think was pretty was very important in that context. It also was maybe a situation where the real estate market in Rochester is not quite as strong as in some other places, especially in New Orleans with Airbnbs and so on. I think the main concern would be you re-urbanize that space and it just gets turned into Airbnbs because it's, basically in the Treme neighborhood. And that, so yeah, the highway is kind of keeping it affordable in this sort of perverse kind of way. But I do think that the city owning the land and being able to attach conditions to its redevelopment and potentially even partner with a public developer, right, or a nonprofit developers in the case of Rochester, right, creates at least some public tools to shape it in a way that's not just kind of throwing land out onto the market. On the engineering side, again, I'm not as specific. I don't have specific knowledge about New Orleans, but the measurements of what they call traffic evaporation seem to be quite real. The question, to go back to the Dallas case, one phenomenon in Dallas was that the north side of Dallas is white and wealthier, and the south side of Dallas is majority African American and poorer, and the northern suburbs are where jobs are located, and the southern suburbs are now increasingly African American. So people have potentially enormous commutes to where the jobs actually are, because there aren't that many jobs in the south. So there was a kind of ironically, the people displaced, or the people whose parents were displaced by the highway, right, were advocating for keeping that highway because now they were dependent on it because they now lived in southern suburbs that were even beyond the reach of the public transit network, which points to the need to also coordinate these types of changes with improvements in public transit as well, right? Otherwise, you are kind of stranding potentially people who, through no fault of their own, are dependent on the highway.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's provide more insights on it. I have another question for Fatemeh. It's, I know your sample is small. Is there like types of caps, or what kind of situation would be good for add caps on highways? And I think there's a, sorry.
Yeah, I'm listening.
Yeah, and also I think, there's a chat, Jason has a question related to about, let's see, gentrification facilitate, a displacement. Yeah, you go ahead. You can, this question, I think there's another one pop up, I think related to, gentrification too. You go ahead and then I will add to that later.
Well, but we didn't look into displacement or community migration in our assessment. We simply looked into changes into housing and socio-demographic variables before and after highway caps projects. This was one way to look at whether these projects are causing gentrification or not. And the variables were like throughout the literature these variables are mostly used for this assessment. But of course, we can't make a definitive conclusion based on this. But in an era that we're looking into ways to reconnect communities, in the era that we're talking about 15-minute cities and how people can walk more and don't go that far, we're trying to reduce the environmental impact of this transportation infrastructure. This could be a potential solution for all of that. And I also saw one comment about whether it's in nature, it is a negative thing, gentrification or not. Well, it's a double-edged sword. So it has positive benefits. It has negative impacts on communities. Honestly, I'm not an expert in that, but I think it has the aim of these projects initially is to serve the community that's living there. So if this changes, forcing them to move that environment, move their home, move out of their homes, so that our affluent community can come and live there. I think that's a negative impact that is worth considering. And I personally see it as something that this negative impacts overcomes the positive impacts that it brings in. But again, I'm not an expert in that. I just looked into how this affected the communities, particularly from accessibility perspective, which is something that I'm more familiar with. It has a very positive benefits from mobility and accessibility perspective.
Yeah, well, I can quickly speak to my opinion about that. The John Speed asked a question about those presentations seem to point to gentrification as an undesirable result of infrastructure changes. If gentrification is not desirable, why? Could someone overview that general topic for a policy like me? Well, it's just my personal understanding of those two things. I think there are two things, gentrification and displacement. I think in general, people goes for gentrification could be positive, negative. People have different opinions on that. I think gentrification is not necessarily a negative thing, but if it's caused displacement, and particularly housing affordability for people who used to live some neighborhood and they couldn't, I think that's where it tends to more negative. But John, you feel free to jump in on what you saw and your opinion on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a perennial debate in going back many years in the literature, right? In the context of I think the concern is in the context of these types of projects that lessen a negative influence that is suppressing property values, right? The concern has to do with, as Guang was saying, right, whether the sort of the community that already lives in that neighborhood is able to benefit from that improvement, right? I think I take a kind of conceptual approach to that gentrification and displacement are two sides of the same coin. And that if we're talking about redevelopment without displacement, then we're actually talking about a different process, right? Redevelopment or sort of reurbanization or something like that, right? And I think one of the tricky pieces, kind of even leaving aside the kind of justice questions, right? These are neighborhoods often, burdened by higher asthma rates and so on, right? Because of the infrastructure, places where people were sort of forced to live due to segregation, African Americans and to a lesser but significant extent, Latinx populations were sort of forced to live due to segregation, right? The removal of that negative influence should be something very positive. I think one of the tricky issues is that from a kind of political economy perspective, it's a version of essentially TOD without value capture, right? You are improving accessibility in some form of state, so you're taking a public action that the spillover effects tend to be captured by private actors, right? And so the public is losing the opportunity for value capture in that regard, right? So that's just leaving aside questions of displacement, et cetera. Displacement, of course, is notoriously difficult to measure, partially because when they've tried to measure displacement, it turns out that poor people, because of being poor, also move a lot when they're not being displaced by gentrification, when they're being evicted in situations where there is no gentrification going on, et cetera, et cetera. So that really throws off the measurements. But I think from a simple kind of like public policy perspective, my sense is that these public actions should have public benefits beyond the simple removal of this negative influence. But actually, if there is a land value increase, then there should be a public value capture of that land value increase, just as we would expect from TOD, rail, et cetera, other kinds of accessibility improvements, right? That's just kind of my sense of it. And that's something that you see in the Bilbao case, right? Bilbao is actually one large tax increment financing district, essentially, right? And so they use money from kind of the revalorization of land in order to build certain buildings, in order to invest in infrastructure improvements. And there's this sort of virtuous cycle that they kind of have going, right? I think that also is part of why neighborhoods that are sort of just to the outside of the urban center don't quite as much figure in that calculation because they're not as central. The revalorization is not as significant and so on, right? But I'll stop there.
You're on mute, Guang.
Thank you. It seems we don't have more questions, and we are about up to the time. Just to pay attention to the chat. There are some webinars about the I-94 for in Minnesota Department of Transportation about their highways. Feel free to join them or connect. I think today's two presentations are very timely, and at the time there are a lot of changes ongoing, and we hope you guys keep working on this area. I think people show their interest on this, and if possible in the future, maybe we can get more research and to present to the committee and who are interested. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. I really appreciate you inviting us, and it was a really, really good conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
Yeah.